Coteau des Prairies, Minnesota, August 1878. The air was thick with the dust of a dry summer and the clang of hammer on iron. On a small rise overlooking the frozen geometry of Homestead claims, something impossible was taking shape. It was not a cabin of sod or timber. It was a cylinder, a massive, upright boiler of riveted iron plate, 14 feet across and climbing to a planned height of 40 feet. Men stopped their wagons on the section road to stare, to shade their eyes and wonder at the madness of the Polak on the Wojciechowski claim. Kazimierz Wojciechowski stood at the base, his hands stained with rust and grease, directing the hoist of another curved plate. He was a quiet man, broad in the shoulders but economical in his movements, his face placid beneath a layer of prairie grime. Around him, a small crew of hired hands, paid in coin that was surely needed elsewhere, sweated and swore as they wrestled the heavy iron into place. The judgment of the Prairie was swift and certain. Eldred Stanisford, the township assessor, had made a special trip out, his ledger book forgotten in his saddlebag. He stood with Jebediah Crane and Silas Putnam, men whose hands had raised half the log cabins in the county, men who understood the unforgiving arithmetic of a Minnesota winter. "It's a drunkard's chimney is what it is," Stanisford declared, not bothering to lower his voice. He was a man whose authority came from measuring and taxing the sensible works of others, and this was an affront to sense itself. Iron sweats in the cold. It'll weep ice from every rivet head. The man's building himself a metal tomb. Silas Putnam, a carpenter who trusted nothing but wood, nodded slowly. "No man raises children in a smokestack. It's unnatural. Where's the hearth? Where's the home in that thing?" Kazimierz heard them. He had been hearing variations of the same sentiment for weeks. He simply sighted along the edge of the newly placed plate, called for a mallet, and tapped it into alignment. He did not argue. He did not defend. He just built. The mockery was a constant buzzing insect in the hot summer air. The validation, he knew, would have to wait for the cold. What did this Polish Gorzelnia stillman, this maker of spirits, understand about the physics of thermal stratification that the most experienced cabin builders on the Prairie had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the simple, powerful physics of how heat moves vertically, a principle that could turn a structure everyone mocked into the warmest, most efficient home on the entire coteau. We'll explore the science, witness the brutal test, and see how one man's quiet confidence, born in a different world, rewrote the rules of survival on the American frontier. If you appreciate stories of ingenuity against the odds, consider subscribing to this channel for more tales of historical innovation. Kazimierz Wojciechowski was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, not by trade. And he was certainly not a frontiersman, in the way his neighbors understood the term. He was a Gorzelnia master, a stillman from the province of Wielkopolska, a region of Poland known for its sophisticated distilleries. His life before America had been a world of copper, fire, and rising vapors. He understood fermentation, yes, but his true expertise was in distillation, specifically in the tall, elegant column stills that could refine spirit to a purity unimaginable from a simple pot still. His hands, now gripping cold iron, had once adjusted the flow of steam through perforated trays stacked one atop the other inside gleaming copper towers. He knew, in a way a farmer knows soil, how heat behaved in a vertical space. He knew that steam, released at the bottom, would rise, surrendering its energy to each tray as it climbed, its temperature dropping in a predictable gradient. He had spent 20 years managing that climb, controlling it, using its inevitable upward journey to create something refined and valuable. He had lived his professional life inside the laws of thermodynamics. When he arrived in Minnesota with his wife Zofia and their two small children, Stanislaw, and Jadwiga, he brought that knowledge with him. It was useless, he thought at first. There were no column stills on the prairie. There was only land, sky, and the coming winter. They built a standard cabin that first year, a tight, chinked log box, just as everyone advised. They did everything right, and they nearly perished. That first winter was a lesson written in ice. It was a cold that was not a temperature, but a presence, an active, malevolent force that seeped through the stoutest walls. Kazimierz remembered the sharp crack of the lamp chimney, a sound like a pistol shot in the frozen silence, as the cold glass met the heat of the flame for the first time each evening. He remembered Zofia's hands, raw and chapped, trying to work dough on the kitchen board, only to watch it seize up and turn a dead gray color before she could even knead it properly. Their cat, a creature of pure survival instinct, abandoned all pretense of dignity and learned to curl into the ash bin of the cast iron stove, emerging each morning coated in a fine gray powder, the only creature in the house that had slept in something resembling warmth. The children, Stanislaw and Jadwiga, lived in a permanent cocoon of wool blankets, their coughs echoing in the frigid air. The memory of that winter was the blueprint for his iron tower. He would not suffer it again. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of materials or effort. It was a failure of design, a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The settlers built their cabins low and wide, believing, not without reason, that a smaller space was easier to heat. They installed a powerful cast iron stove in the center, a ravenous beast that consumed cords of precious oak and maple at an astonishing rate. The problem wasn't a lack of heat. The stove could glow cherry red, capable of producing thousands of BTUs. The problem was where that heat went. The laws of physics are indifferent to human comfort. Hot air is less dense than cold air. It rises. In a standard 14 by 20 foot cabin with an 8-foot ceiling, a river of heat flowed directly from the stove to the roof. A man standing on a chair could feel the sweat bead on his forehead, a blistering 85 or 90 degrees in the rafters, while his feet, planted on the floorboards, remained numb at a miserable 35 degrees. The family lived perpetually in a thermal inversion, their heads in summer, their feet in winter. This stratification was the primary failure. The useful heat, the heat that could warm a child's bed or keep broth from freezing, was trapped uselessly overhead, bleeding out through the roof shingles. Meanwhile, the cold, dense air pooled at the floor, a lake of misery that never drained. Every time the door opened, a fresh wave of Arctic air would pour in, not rising, but spreading across the floor like spilled water, displacing the slightly less cold air and renewing the family's suffering. Neighbors like the O'Malley family, with 4 children, burned through their entire winter's woodpile by February and spent March huddled together under a mountain of quilts, their stove cold. The Svensons, a mile to the east, stuffed rags into every crack and seam, creating a nearly airtight box, only to find the air stale and the cold just as persistent. They were all fighting the same battle, trying to heat a horizontal space with a force that only wanted to move vertically. They were trying to push a river uphill. Kazimierz watched his neighbors and saw the flaw. They were trying to heat the floor. It was an impossible task. He knew from his years in the distillery that you did not fight the rise. You designed for it. You built a vessel that took advantage of it. The construction of the tower was a spectacle. The iron plates, a 1/4 inch thick, were purchased from a scrap dealer in St. Paul who had acquired them from a dismantled steamboat. They arrived by rail and then by ox cart, their journey ending on this windswept prairie hill. Kazimierz had designed a simple derrick to hoist them into place. He hired a blacksmith to manage the forge. heating rivets to a glowing orange-yellow before they were passed to the buckers, who hammered them home, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoing for miles. The foundation was a deep ring of fieldstone filled with sand for stability. Upon this, the first course of iron was laid. But before the walls began their climb, Kazimierz started the tower's heart. He, with the help of a local stonemason who thought the entire project was folly but was glad for the work, began to build the central flue. It was a square column of brick and mortar, 4 feet by 4 feet, hollow in the center, rising from the very foundation. This was not a chimney to be tucked into a wall. It was a spine, a central pillar from which the entire structure would grow. As the flue rose, the iron cylinder rose around it, leaving a 5-foot gap on all sides for the living space. At 8-foot intervals, Kazimierz had the masons leave openings in the brick spine. Into these, he and his crew socketed heavy timber joists, cantilevered out from the masonry. They did not touch the outer iron wall. They hung from the central column, creating the support for each of the 4 floors. Eldred Stanisford returned often, drawn by a morbid curiosity. He stood, arms crossed, watching the strange skeleton take shape. "You see that?" he said to Silas Putnam, who'd joined him. "The floors don't even touch the walls. A good wind will rattle the teeth out of their heads. The whole thing will shake like a dog passing a peach pit." It was during the framing of the second floor that Stanisford delivered his most memorable verdict. "Wojciechowski," he called out, his voice carrying in the clear air. "I've been assessing property in this territory for 15 years. I've seen soddies, dugouts, and log huts, but I have never, in all my days, seen a man build a house for his family that looks more like a drunkard's chimney." Kazimierz, perched on a joist 20 feet up, paused, looked down at the assessor, and gave the slightest of nods. "Heat is a drunkard," he said, his Polish accent softening the words. "It always wants to go up." Then he turned back to his work, leaving Stanisford sputtering. Zofia watched the construction with a mixture of fear and faith. She had endured the first winter. She trusted her husband's quiet, methodical mind. But the appearance of the thing was unsettling. "It looks like a water tank, Kazimierz," she said one evening as they stood watching the sunset paint the west-facing curve of iron in shades of orange and purple. "Will the children be safe? Will it be a home?" He took her hand, his own calloused and hard. "It will be warm, Zofia," he said, "and where there is warmth, a home can grow." The spiral staircase, built from rough sawn pine, was the last major piece. It wound its way up the interior, hugging the central flue. Openings were cut between floors, not just for the stairs, but as deliberate ports, grates in the floor, to ensure the air could continue its journey. The windows were small, salvaged from a church that had burned down and carefully sealed. The iron exterior was painted with a thick, black, asphalt-based paint used for sealing boat hulls. By the first frost of October, the tower was complete. It stood on the prairie, stark and alien, a 40-foot exclamation point of black iron against the muted autumn golds and browns. To understand the genius of the Iron Tower, one must first understand the enemy it was designed to defeat: heat loss. But more specifically, it was designed to cooperate with a principle his neighbors fought every day: thermal stratification. In any heated space, air organizes itself by temperature. The warmest, least dense air rises to the highest point, while the coolest, densest air sinks to the lowest. A standard cabin, being a wide, low box, maximized this problem. The living zone, the space from the floor to about 6 feet up, was perpetually filled with the coldest air in the building. The heat, generated by the stove, made a one-way trip to the ceiling where its energy was wasted, conducted through the roof into the Arctic sky. Kazimierz's tower did not fight this principle. It embraced it. The entire 40-foot structure was designed as a single, continuous column of air. The stove, a small but efficient cast iron box, was on the first floor, the kitchen and living area. Its flue pipe fed directly into the central masonry spine. This spine was the tower's engine. As the hot exhaust gases, perhaps 400 degrees Fahrenheit, entered the base of the flue, they began their long, slow, 40-foot climb to the sky. A chimney on a normal cabin is an escape route for smoke, and its heat is mostly wasted. But Kazimierz' flue was a thermal battery. The brick and mortar of the 4-by-4-foot column had tremendous thermal mass. As the hot gases rose, they transferred the majority of their heat energy into the masonry. The brick walls of the flue on the first floor became a massive, gentle radiator, warming the living space. By the time the gases reached the second floor, they were cooler, but still hot enough to heat the masonry there, which in turn radiated warmth into the children's bedroom. The process repeated on the third floor, Zofia's workspace for sewing and mending, and again on the fourth, a storage and guest room. By the time the smoke finally exited the top of the tower, it had surrendered nearly all its useful heat to the structure. An outside observer would see only a faint, lazy wisp of smoke, a sign of an efficient burn with minimal wasted energy. The central flue warmed the core of the building on all 4 levels simultaneously, using the energy from a single, small fire. But this was only half the system. The second part was the circulation of the air within the living space itself. The air, warmed by contact with the flue on the first floor, would rise. The open design of the spiral staircase and the deliberate grate openings in the floors allowed this warm air to continue its natural upward journey. It climbed from the first floor to the second to the third to the fourth. As it reached the top, it would cool slightly against the small windows and the iron skin of the tower. Now denser, it would begin to sink, flowing down the cooler outer perimeter of the tower, drawn back towards the stove on the first floor to be reheated. The tower was not a static box. It was a living, breathing, convective loop, a slow, gentle, continuous current of air, rising up the warm core and sinking down the cooler edges, distributing warmth evenly across all 4 floors. Kazimierz didn't need to heat 4 separate rooms. He only needed to heat the bottom of a single, 40-foot-tall column of air and let physics do the rest. That winter, the Prairie decided to test the iron tower with a particular kind of cold, a cold that broke the spirit of even the hardiest settlers. It was not a blizzard, not a storm of wind and snow. It was a high-pressure system that settled over the plains and refused to move. For 13 consecutive nights, the sky was utterly clear, a brilliant, star-dusted canopy of black that offered no insulating blanket of clouds. The wind fell completely still. This was a Koto radiation freeze. The Earth, unprotected, radiated all its heat directly into the void of space. The cold air, heavy and dense, pooled in the valleys and crept across the flatlands, growing colder each night. The official temperature at the land office in Marshall dropped to minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a siege. The world outside went silent and brittle. The pop of a freezing tree trunk sounded like a rifle shot. Jebediah Crane lost 2 of his best milk cows. They simply froze, standing in his barn. The Svensson's well pump, despite being wrapped in burlap, seized into a solid block of iron. Inside their homes, the battle was constant. Every nail head in the walls became a tiny white flower of frost. Ice grew in feathery patterns on the inside of the window panes, an inch thick. Families burned through wood with a desperate ferocity, yet the cold lake on the floor never receded. Inside the iron tower, a different reality unfolded. The small stove on the first floor was fed a steady diet of oak, but not a frantic one. The central flue soaked up the heat, and the air began its slow, majestic circulation. On the second floor, Stanisław and Jadwiga lay on a rug in their stocking feet, reading a book by the light of a kerosene lamp. There were no drafts. The air was still and quiet. On the third floor, Zofia had a batch of bread dough rising in a wooden bowl on the table, covered by a simple cloth. The yeast was alive and active. It was a miracle of warmth and biology that no other woman on the prairie could perform that night. The ultimate proof lay on the fourth floor, the highest and most exposed part of the structure. On a simple pine shelf sat a row of Zofia's canned goods from the summer's harvest. Among them was a crock of gooseberry preserves. In the crushing, absolute cold of a radiation freeze, the water content in jams and preserves would freeze and expand. In Stanisford's own pantry, a similar crock of marmalade had cracked that very night. A thin line of frozen orange leaking from the fissure. But here, 40 feet above the frozen prairie, Kazimierz took a spoon, lifted the lid of the crock, and dipped it in. The preserves yielded softly, easily. They were cool, but they were liquid, spoon soft. The warmth had reached the very top. The system was working perfectly. Eldred Stanisford was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a man of ledgers, measurements, and taxable assets. His work in the depths of that freeze was grim. He rode the section lines on his sturdiest horse, his face wrapped in wool, until only his eyes were visible, tallying the dead. Not people, not yet, but the things that kept people alive. He was counting the frost-killed apple orchards, the young trees whose sap had frozen and split their trunks. It was a landscape of failure, a testament to the overwhelming power of the cold. As dusk fell on the 10th day of the freeze, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of violet and gray, Stanisford found himself on the ridge overlooking the Wojciechowski claim. He was cold to the bone, his faith in conventional wisdom affirmed by every split tree trunk he'd recorded. He looked toward the foolish iron tower, expecting to see it sheathed in the same thick coat of hoarfrost that covered everything else. Frost was the great revealer. It clung thickest where heat was escaping, condensing, and freezing on the cold surface. Every cabin chimney he had seen that day wore a thick white beard of it, a clear sign of a desperate, inefficient battle, of precious heat pouring into the sky. But the tower was different. Against the white snow, it was a stark, black line. It was ungloved by hoarfrost. Its dark, painted iron skin was almost completely bare. Stanisford reined in his horse, which stood steaming in the frigid air. He stared. He could see the very top of the masonry flue poking out from the roof. From it, a thin, almost invisible plume of vapor rose. There was no whitebeard. The heat was not escaping. It was staying inside. The visual evidence was so clear, so contrary to everything he knew, that it felt like a physical blow. A structure that should have been the coldest, most miserable place on the prairie was somehow the most thermally efficient. In the middle of the empty section road, Eldred Stanisford stopped his horse and simply stared at the impossible black tower. Later that week, he made his way to the tower. He didn't come with mockery, but with a quiet, unnerving curiosity. Kazimierz saw him coming and met him at the door. Stanisford didn't waste words. "Wojciechowski, I need to see inside." Kazimierz nodded and stepped aside. The moment Stanisford crossed the threshold, the vindication began. He had expected to be hit by a blast of concentrated heat from a roaring stove with cold air pooling at his boots. Instead, the air was just warm, evenly, calmly warm. He took off his heavy gloves, then his hat. He could feel the warmth on his face, around his ankles. It was uncanny. Without a word, Kazimierz gestured toward the spiral stairs. Stanisford began to climb. As he ascended past the second floor, he saw the two children playing on the floor, seemingly unaware of the Arctic apocalypse outside. He continued to the third, where Zofia sat sewing, her hands nimble, not stiff with cold. He kept climbing to the fourth floor. He felt the air. It was slightly cooler than the first floor, but it was still profoundly, impossibly warm. He saw the shelves of preserved food. He walked over, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden planks. He looked at the crock of gooseberry preserves, the one that sat as a silent testament. He reached out a bare hand and laid his palm against the cool crockery. It was not warm, but it was not frozen. It felt like an object in a cellar, not one at the edge of the abyss. He remembered the sound of his own jar cracking. The gap between expectation and reality was absolute. He turned to Kazimierz, who had followed him up. He looked at the quiet stillman, at the strange, circular room. He struggled for words to describe what he was feeling, this complete inversion of his world. He looked at the central brick column, the source of it all. "You didn't build a house, Wojciechowski," the assessor said, his voice low with a kind of awe. "You built a weather system?" When spring finally came, and the ledgers were brought out for the year's valuations, Eldred Stanisford did something unprecedented. Under the standard property classifications of dwelling timber frame, dwelling log, and barn/outbuilding, he dipped his pen and wrote a new line. Wojciechowski, K. Dwelling, vertical, iron. It was an official act of recognition. The mockery was over. The validation was now part of the public record. The story of the Warm Tower spread, carried by Stanisford himself. He was the most credible witness imaginable, the former arch-skeptic. He didn't just praise it, he explained it, using his own newfound understanding of the rising heat, the central flue, the convective loop. He spoke of it at the township meetings and at the general store. The drunkard's chimney was now the Polish Tower, a name spoken with respect. The most receptive audience was in the nearby settlement of Wilno, a community of Polish immigrants who knew Kazimierz's reputation from the old country. They understood that a man who could command the subtle forces inside a distillation column might also command the heat in a home. That summer, 3 Wilno families, the Kowalskis, the Zielinskis, and the Nowaks, pooled their resources, ordered iron plates from St. Paul, and began raising towers of their own, with Kazimierz Wojciechowski acting as their quiet, unpaid consultant. The idea was spreading, not through books or pamphlets, but through direct, undeniable proof. The principles that Kazimierz Wojciechowski employed in his iron tower were not magic. They were a masterful application of physics, anticipating concepts that would not become mainstream in building science for nearly a century. His central heat-radiating masonry core is a direct ancestor of the modern high-rise service core, which bundles utilities and structural support in the center of the building. His understanding of the stack effect, the natural tendency of warm air to rise and create circulation, is a cornerstone of modern passive heating and cooling design. He had built with scrap iron and fieldstone, Dokhadanchiwan's Arhalin Konstone, a high-performance home that managed airflow and thermal mass with a sophistication that many modern buildings still fail to achieve. The genius of Kazimierz Wojciechowski was not that he found a way to make a bigger fire. It was that he fundamentally redefined the shape of the space to be heated. His neighbors saw their homes as a collection of horizontal surfaces, floors and ceilings, and fought a losing battle to warm the bottom one. They were trying to heat 4 separate rooms. Kazimierz saw his home as a single, vertical volume of air. He didn't heat 4 rooms. He heated 1 column and let the rooms drink from it. It was a profound shift in thinking, from a brute force battle against the cold to an elegant partnership with the unchangeable laws of nature. On the frozen plains of Minnesota, the Stillman had shown the frontiersmen that sometimes The best way to conquer a force is to simply give it the perfect path to follow. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. Let us know in the comments. What other modern technologies do you see foreshadowed in historical, low-tech innovations? We appreciate your support. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The story presented is a fictionalized historical reconstruction inspired by real principles and practices of the era. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. The technical principles are based on historical practices, but any application of such techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.